Hello, I'm Brett Knowles from PM Squared Consulting. This short webinar provides you with an overview of best practices in benchmarking inside of the public sector. Now, I'm not going to be reviewing the standard benchmarking stuff. I'm assuming that you're coming into this webinar understanding the fundamentals of benchmarking. I really want to highlight what is unique about the public sector and where those opportunities take you. Our background is we've been involved in performance measurement and management since the late 1980s, when we were involved with some of the initial research with Drs. Kaplan and Norton at Harvard around the balanced scorecard. Over the years, every single book that they've written cite our clients as best case examples, as do most of the other books on performance measurement and benchmarking. We've done a large number of public sector clients. This is representative images of our federal, provincial, and state clients. They've all been able to leverage our ideas into creating value in their organizations. So the premise of this presentation is really as follows. Obviously, benchmarking is about how you can compare your organization to other organizations to estimate how well your organization is performing. The problem is this falls down in most instances because every organization is unique in some major or macro ways, and therefore generic benchmarking really is difficult to do. Therefore, you really must understand your organization's strategy and your organization's priorities. Secondly, you have to understand your organization's core processes that enable that strategy. And thirdly, you need to be able to compare similar processes from other sources to do effective benchmarking. Let's take a look at this. First, let's talk about how it is you can understand your organization's strategy and priorities. This example is purely fictitious, but the concept is we should be able to go to any organization and be able to describe its strategy, in this case, the context of the balanced scorecard, within the four perspectives of what your stakeholders want, what your internal processes need to be to meet those needs, what are the enablers to build and maintain those processes, and then what are the financial or budgetary constraints beneath all of that. So if we were to take a look at an organization, in this case a hospital, we should be able to easily pick out its mission, vision, values, and strategy. Typically these are well documented, and all we need to do is harvest from those documents what are the key objectives that the organization has already thought about and agreed to. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, we just need to grab those objectives and begin putting them into context. In this case, we'll use the balanced scorecard framework. You could use any you wanted to, from Baldrige to ISO and so forth. We should be able to move those perspectives to describe the cause and effect relationship on how they work to create success for the organization. So in this case, to create a healthier world, there's three things we need to do. You need to deliver physical, emotional, and spiritual care, treat with compassion and dignity, and advance healthcare education, and so forth. So we can begin to describe how these objectives work in order to create success. This is important for benchmarking because it's how they work together that will begin to identify where your candidate benchmarking organizations are. The next step, once you've identified these few core strategic objectives, is to prioritize them. They're not all equally important. And the thing is, if an objective is more important than another, we probably want to spend more effort in benchmarking that effectively. On the other hand, for less important objectives, we still need to benchmark them, but we don't need to be as rigorous in the benchmarking activities we do. Now, the dream, of course, is to be able to benchmark them and compared to those benchmarks, determine whether we're meeting those benchmark standards. In this case, we'll color those objectives green. Slightly behind our benchmarks, in which case color it gold or yellow, and then are we significantly behind, in this case color it red. Now, even at this point, we begin to learn stuff, because in this case, if this objective, even though we're performing poorly against our benchmark, only has a weighting of 5%, that may be less important to us than this objective where we're marginally behind the benchmark, but it's way more important, 20%. So we're trying to guide leadership towards managing what's important. But the problem, as I mentioned earlier on, is this. Because these objectives are so huge, it becomes hard for us to be able to find right benchmark data. I mean, how difficult would it be to benchmark against deliver physical, emotional, and spiritual care? That's so unique to this organization. It's hard to find comparative data. Number two, in other cases, the benchmarks can be found, but they're irrelevant to your organization. In this case, there are many, many ways to innovate patient care, but only some of which are appropriate to this organization. Benchmarking against other innovative patient care may not be very useful. And finally, in many cases, it's just completely unactionable. Even if we could benchmark, demonstrate social responsibility, what are you going to do about it? How can we roll up our shirt sleeves and take action on this benchmark data? So to do that, we need to do this second step, which is knowing how your organization's core processes enable that strategy. The concept is straightforward. We should be able to take that strategy map and list those objectives on the left, and then take the work that you've already done around core processes and put that across the top. You see, if a process supports a highly weighted strategic objective, it has to perform at a higher level. A simple example would be handing out hamburgers at McDonald's versus handing out babies at the hospital. Because babies at the hospital links to a much more important strategic objective, it has to be performed at a higher quality level. So we can do a simple analysis of the impact in performance. So in this case, if we take a look at, say, patient scheduling, we might decide if we scale it out of 5 that its impact on creating a healthier world is, say, a 4 out of 5. If we take a look at the impact of patient scheduling on delivering care, you know what? It really doesn't have an impact. We don't need to give it a score. If we take a look at the impact of patient scheduling on treat with compassion, let's say that has an impact of 4. And patient scheduling impact on advanced healthcare is not as great. Let's give it a 3. Now we know where we need to benchmark. Obviously, we don't need to waste time trying to benchmark around deliver care and patient scheduling because there's no relationship. When we come to look at the performance, again, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at that benchmark. How are we performing against that benchmark? And we're looking for an organization that does some form of scheduling, hopefully patient scheduling, that supports in somehow or the other creating a healthier world. So this is a very specific benchmark that we're looking for. And in fact, that makes finding the benchmark easier than looking for some very generalized one. So in this case, we might give ourselves a score of, say, 4, and the net mathematics say that's green. We also have an impact of 4 on treat with compassion, and it also has a performance of 4. But in this case, 4 on performance is not good enough. Being slightly behind our benchmark on this performance nets a red performance. Because the weighting is so high, we need to make sure that we perform against benchmark at a much higher level. And then finally, let's give ourselves a 4 on advancing health education. By the time we're done, we have an interesting view, both horizontally and vertically, of how well our strategy is enabled through our current processes. So we could, of course, visually represent this data by adding it up horizontally by strategic objective. And what we see here is the total length of the bar represents the amount of process support we need, in this example, for delivering care. The blue bar represents how well we're currently performing, and the gold represents the gap between our current performance and what the strategy calls for. Now, the analysis is not all that scientific. The impact is somewhat of the team score, and of course, how you perform against benchmarks is interesting, but again, not necessarily a hard science. But in this case, you can see that these 3 objectives are order of magnitude bigger gaps than the others. So we don't need to be that precise when inevitably we have these significant gaps that benchmarking reveals. Now, I've shown you what the results are from one benchmark, but you can extend that to 3 or 4 other organizations and look at the averages and so forth. The net is the information becomes very interesting. Likewise, we could add this up vertically and get a view of how your processes are performing, again, by strategic objective, strategic impact against the strategic objectives. So the concept is we can get a better reading of benchmark in the public sector by understanding what your strategy and priorities are, understanding how your core processes link to those, and then begin taking a look at the actual performance of those specific process and strategic objectives. To learn more, please join us at pm2consulting.com.